Hello and welcome to Psychgeist, where we talk about the psychology of the era, the science of games. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Kowert, and on today's episode of Jargon Schmargon, we're going to be exploring the term dark participation. You may have heard me use the term dark participation before when talking about trolling and toxicity in games. In fact, I explored it quite extensively in the previous state of the research on toxicity in games, which ultimately led to the publication of this paper, Dark Participation in Games in 2020. That said, I thought for the sake of clarity, it would be helpful to have a standalone video exploring this term. Toxicity, trolling, toxic cultures, all of these terms have long been discussed specifically within the context of games. However, as a subject of study, it's a relatively confusing space because everybody seems to have a different term for the same behavior or the same term for a different behavior. It's confusing. While some researchers treat any deceptive action as toxic, deception is not always required by other researchers. Other negative behaviors with perceived hostile intent are also sometimes grouped into trolling, whereas other researchers treat them as separate concepts. To add to the confusion, the words trolling and toxicity are often used interchangeably, with little differentiation made to distinguish the two terms. The term dark participation has started to come into favor as a way to alleviate some of this confusion. I first heard the term used by Professor Quant at the University of Münster, credit where credit is due. I then myself started using it specifically within the context of games in an effort to really foster a shared language about these behaviors in games. Having a shared language around trolling and toxicity, dark participation, deviant behavior, there's a lot of words here. It's a critical step for understanding these kinds of behaviors in games, the antecedents, the consequences, and in unifying scholarly efforts. We all have to be on the same page. So what is the difference between dark participation, toxicity, and trolling? From the broadest perspective, all deviant behavior that takes place online, both in and out of games, can be placed under this heading of dark participation. All deviant verbal and behavioral actions that take place on the internet would fall under this categorization. The outcome of these behaviors that cause harm to another's health or well-being, that would be considered toxic. So the distinction here between dark participation and toxic behavior is that dark participation is all of the behaviors and toxicity is the outcome if there is harm. Now, it's important to note there's a key distinction between dark participation and toxic behavior from a cultural context. Dark participation is any deviant action, but what constitutes something as toxic is often culturally defined. So dark participation is always deviant in the context of the environment, but what behaviors are considered toxic, what behaviors are considered to cause harm, may or may not be the same depending on the context. For example, contrary play, playing a game in a way that the game was not intended for you to play, may or may not be considered toxic. Speedrunning would be an example of contrary play, which in most instances is not considered toxic, even though it's contrary to normal gameplay. However, in other cases, using the game in unintended ways could be considered toxic by players, like using exploits to gain an in-game advantage. Looking at you, ZG. Thus, contrary play is not a behavior that necessarily causes harm and disrupts the play of others. So it's not necessarily toxic, but it is deviant, so it is dark participation. So that covers dark participation and toxicity. Dark participation is the act, toxicity is the outcome, trolling is the intent. In internet slang, a troll is someone who sows discord on the internet with the deliberate intent of eliciting an emotional or otherwise disrupting response. Deliberate intent is the key phrase in this definition. Things that would be considered trolling would be things like trash talking, griefing, and doxing, as all of these actions are done with the specific intent of causing annoyance, distress, or harm to another player. So, dark participation, an umbrella term that refers to any deviant behavior happening in games, from trash talking to spamming to doxing. Toxicity is the outcome of these behaviors and is culturally defined. Trolling is the intent of the perpetrator. If you like this video and want to see more, please like and subscribe. And until next time, be excellent to each other and always cite your sources. And buy this merch.